Okay, now we're here to talk about CSRD. Are you ready? This acronym is hopefully somewhat familiar to most of you, but if it's not, you will leave the next 50 minutes being very familiar with it, maybe a little scared of it, which you should be, but nonetheless, this should be super educational. To talk to you about CSRD initially is someone that has forgotten more about ESG than I know. It's the Senior Vice President of Innovation and Accounts at our partner Datamaran, Donato Calace. Donato?
Good afternoon, everybody. How do you feel? Do you feel energized to talk about regulation? I know it's not the most exciting thing to talk about today, but here we are. I'll try to make it as much interesting as possible. And we have this very important mission to brief you on CSRD in the next 15 minutes. And I want to allow you to ask questions in the end. So I'll try to be as concise as possible in my presentation. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is CSRD? Let's do a little show of hands here. How many of you are familiar with CSRD in the room? Okay, there are some people, that's great. How many of you are actually working on the implementation of CSRD in their organization right now? A bit less, but still good. Okay, fantastic. So for those of you that are not familiar with CSRD, CSRD is another acronym in the ESG space, like we really needed that, and stands for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So it's EU legislation, and it was actually passed in December 2022. It was published on the official journal, and now it's already into force. We will see what the timeline is in detail in a couple of slides, but the first batch of companies will start reporting according to the CSRD requirements from 2024 for the report published in 2025. Now, some of you may already know that there was another regulation in the EU that was mandating sustainability disclosures and ESG disclosures. That was the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, initially introduced back in 2014. One of the key differences, there are many key differences between the two. I will say that the sort of common thread there is that the level of ambition of the European Union with the CSRD is way higher. So there are more demanding requirements and the scope is bigger, as we will see in a minute. But one of the key differences with the Non-Financial Reporting Directive is that the Non-Financial Reporting Directive was asking companies to publish a sustainability report covering different areas, but companies were free to pick which standards or frameworks to use, whether the Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, or whatever other standards they would choose. In this case, with CSRD, that's not possible anymore. There is a mandatory standard that is being developed by the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, and it's called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. I've been in their expert working group reviewing the standards. I will talk about more in detail what you can expect from these standards. But if you have also follow-up questions, I would be happy to answer these. So let's move on. Let's go a bit deeper in the details of what's new with the CSRD. We already said that compared to the past, now there is an obligation to use the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. But in addition to that, the goal of the European Union is to have standardized and homogenized disclosures on ESG so that investors, regulators, can look easily for this kind of information. What does that mean in practice? Well, actually, those disclosures won't go anymore in a separate report, but they will be part of the management report of the financial statements. So there will be only one report with a dedicated sustainability statement section, and the structure of these sustainability statements is also codified. So the nomenclature, like the titles, the headers that you can use, the structure of it, it's all codified. There's no more wiggle room in that sense. The other key aspect is that to determine on which data points to report, companies will be required to conduct a double materiality assessment. We'll see what double materiality assessment means in practice. We'll talk about it also in our next panel, but it's fundamentally different from the traditional materiality assessment that many of you may be familiar with under GRI, for example. Another key aspect is the increased focus on the value chain. There are requirements to cover ESG impacts, risk and opportunities along the value chain, so upstream and downstream as well. And also all these disclosures are subject to mandatory third-party audit. So that would be limited assurance at the beginning, but the vision is to have reasonable assurance on these disclosures. But which companies fall in scope, right? So let's have a look at that. The key message here is that the original coverage of NFRD was around 11,000 companies in Europe. With the CSRD rules, that will be over 50,000 companies, and that covers Europe only. Because the impact of CSRD, what it makes really interesting, is that it will apply also to non-European companies that have certain operations in Europe. So I guess all of you know GDPR, right? General Data Protection Regulation. GDPR sort of created a new standard for data protection worldwide, although it's enforced only for two companies that have data in Europe. This could be the equivalent of the GDPR for sustainability disclosures, effectively. Just to give you like a summary of the companies this will apply to, it will apply to all the companies, doesn't matter if public or private, that have at least 250 employees, 20 million in total assets, or 40 million in annual revenues. So it is sufficient to have two out of three of these requirements to fall in the scope. Then obviously listed companies in the EU will fall into the scope, and as I said, it will apply only also to non-European companies, provided that those have either securities admitted to trading in EU-regulated markets, or they have revenues for at least 150 million in the EU, plus a local branch. So it's not really demanding in terms of requirements. It's very easy to fall in scope. Actually, we work on research with the Wall Street Journal in terms of how many non-EU companies CSRD will apply, and we estimated that it would be at least 10,000, if not more. Next question is, from when? So, good news is that there is a bit of time to prepare, but the timeline is very tight, and there are different reasons why the EU is working on such a tight timeline. However, so from next year, all the companies subject to the non-financial reporting directive will start to report according to CSRD for the report that will be published in 2025, so covering year 2024. From 2025, it will be the rest of the EU companies that have at least 250 employees. Then 2026 is a small set of publicly listed SMEs, so those are small and medium enterprises that are listed nonetheless. It's a very specific case. And then from 2028, it would be all the non-EU companies that have at least 150 million revenues in Europe. However, the reality is that a lot of these companies may be already captured here. What do I mean by that? Well, there are many non-EU companies, especially in the US, that have local subsidiaries or many local entities in Europe that have more than 250 employees. For these companies, there would be a choice, really. Either start building the reporting structure for the local subsidiary that would be subject from 2025, or apply the subsidiary exemption mechanism, report at the parent company level instead of the local subsidiary level here. So what to report on? Just to give you like a sense of the coverage of these standards. Right now, EFRAG published the first draft of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Those were published back in November. This is set one of the standards and cover all those standards that apply regardless of the sectors. EFRAG is now working on the set 2 of standards that will include 39 sector-specific standards. So the final reporting suite standards, let's say, will have both sector-agnostic standards, so those standards that will apply to all sectors, which are the ones that you see here, plus the sector-specific standards that will be released in the next 4 years. In terms of numbers, just to give you an idea, you have 12 standards right now. 2 of them are cross-cutting standards. So those standards are general. They include the general requirements and general disclosures. And then you have 10 topical standards, 5 environmental, then you have 4 social, and 1 governance. Each of these standards has, well, in total, there are 82 disclosure requirements within those standards for a total of 1,144 data points. Not all of these data points are mandatory. Actually, they're subject to a materiality assessment. So you, as a company, you need to conduct the double materiality assessment, determine which topics are material to you and which data points you will disclose on. I know the question that you probably have in your mind. There will be a spreadsheet with the list of data points that EFRAG will publish in the summer. So, how to know if you're prepared? First of all, ask yourself, how familiar are you with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards? The first draft, as I said, were published back in November, but there's no better time to become familiar now because the European Commission just launched a 4 weeks public consultation on the content of the standards. So it's a good time to engage with them and to share feedback. Becoming familiar with the concept of double materiality. So double materiality essentially posits that ESG issues have an impact on the financial value of the company, and depending on the materiality of that impact, they can be strategic and material for the company, but also the companies, through their activities, operations, investments, have an impact on environment and society. So also those impacts are relevant. So it's a broader scope compared to the traditional materiality assessment, let's say. Then another key aspect is that of these 82 disclosure requirements that I mentioned before, around 50% are metrics and indicators. The remaining are about policies, actions, and targets. So don't think of the ESRS as a checklist of indicators that you need to report on, because there will be questions like, for example, ESRS E1 climate. The first disclosure requirement that you have there is, what is your transition plan for climate? And is that aligned with the 1.5 degree threshold? So they're not asking about scope 1, scope 2 emissions, but what are the plans? What are the actions? What are the strategies? What is the governance that companies have in place around these issues? So obviously, these means that you need different elements to be ready on your side. First of all, like the governance around it. So who is overseeing this process? Who actually will oversight according to the ESRS requirements? But second, you will also need the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure that can help you manage this information, collect it, and use it. So on that note, I'll pass it back to Trevor that will explain how tech can help.
Thank you, Donato. And sit tight because he's going to be on our panel. We're not done with him just quite yet. So CSRD covers so many things, right? And how can tech help? This is the key, and this is what we're about to talk about. It can help in areas like climate change, thinking about target setting, thinking about managing your carbon emissions, setting net zero goals, and tracking your progress towards them. That's a job for technology. Pollution, that's in there. We all know and love / hate pollution. Something Intelex is very good at managing: air, water, waste emissions. But think more. Think about the financial effects of that pollution on your company, on the community around you. There's more to it. Again, this is a job for some solution that can really crunch the numbers. Biodiversity and consumption. Do you know exactly where all your raw materials are coming from and the impacts of those, the ethics within that supply chain, et cetera? And even think about your own workers, as they call it, right? Health and safety performance, near and dear to all of our hearts. Of course, we know the role technology plays there. But think about work-life balance. Think about training data that could be EHS training or kind of your corporate compliance training. All that has to come in. There's just so many ways in which technology can help. There's these 4, and there are so many more.